Welcome everyone to the Monarch Habitat Restoration presentation. My name is Karine Motivans and I work at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. We're here in West Virginia. We're very pleased to be co-hosting this webinar series with the Monarch joint venture. This is our second webinar and we'll continue these programs throughout 2015. We've got a great diversity of participants here today. Everyone, it seems, is passionate about monarchs. We've got several federal agencies here representing, every federal partner we've ever had: Forest Service, Park Service, USGS, BLM, Department of Transportation. Welcome to the states. We love to see you here. State people who are land managers in places like California, Minnesota, Florida, and Texas, and all those Department of Transportation folks at the state level, welcome. Counties are represented here. Shout out to Franklin County, Ohio, Douglas County, Kansas. We've got tons of counties as well as city governments here today, large and small. We have universities, friends groups, many, many wonderful conservation nonprofit groups, and rounding out the audience are consultants, master gardeners, churches, nature centers, and home gardeners. Welcome, everyone. Since you've already provided your email to us today, we're going to make sure that you're sent announcements for future presentations. We're also recording today's webinar, and it will be available to you online, and we'll make sure you get that link. I'm excited to share another monarch butterfly activity, the Wild Read. It's an online book club, and it is a space where we share book discussions on conservation topics. And I'm very excited to tell you that on March 1st, the Wild Read will be hosted by author Robert Michael Pyle, and he'll discuss his book, Chasing Monarchs. That's the cover of the book down there in the lower left-hand corner. It's a story that follows the migratory route of monarchs, and he's got such a great writing style. He discovers the secrets and tribulations of the monarch's journey. He's a respected author on butterflies. Dr. Pyle has written several books, including the Audubon Society Field Guide to Butterflies of North America. So find yourself a copy of the book, Chasing Monarchs. Join the conversation with the author at our virtual book club. Okay, and share this opportunity with your friends and coworkers. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some of the features of the live stream. This is the platform we're looking at today. We encourage questions during the presentation, so use the chat box. Thank you for all of you who've been using it to kind of say hello and tell us where you're from. It's awesome. Type in your question down there at that lower box way at the bottom, and then click Say. You can type in your first name the first time. Once you've done that, you can keep asking questions. Now, of course, we can't answer all your questions, but we've got a plan for that. We're going to collect all the questions and provide answers to them over the next week or so and post that up on the website. So we'll try to categorize them and really try to reach every one of your questions. Finally, if you're not getting a good internet connection or your computer speakers give out, or you can maybe you have to leave and you want to join and listen in on the phone line, you can do this. We have a listen-only option. It's a last resort. You would not be able to see the slides if you're just using your phone. But remember, the entire program will be recorded and you can watch it later, and we will email you that link. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy Caldwell, our coordinator at the Monarch Joint Venture and my esteemed partner in this webinar series. She's going to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Karine, and hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Eric Lee Mader from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Eric is a co-director of their Pollinator program, their Pollinator Conservation Program at the Xerces Society. He works with farmers, gardeners, land managers, and agencies from across the world to restore native habitat in working agricultural lands. In today's presentation, he's going to focus specifically on habitat restoration for monarch butterflies. So welcome, Eric, and we're looking forward to the information you're going to share today.
All right. Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Karine, and thank you for everybody who's tuning in today. We've got a lot of material to cover this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in the country, and we're going to try to move along fairly quickly. And I recognize that there will probably be a lot of questions throughout the presentation, and Wendy will be serving as sort of my wing person throughout the presentation, and we will pause at some relevant moments and try to take some of your questions. And if we go a little bit over, Wendy and I are prepared to stay on the line as well and answer some additional questions for those of you who can stick around. So why don't we dive right in here and talk about habitat restoration basics. And this really is a presentation intended to cover the basics. And my work focuses broadly on pollinator conservation, especially pollinator conservation in agricultural lands. So some of these themes that we'll talk about here have relevance beyond just monarchs and have relevance for things like native bees. And where appropriate, I'll try to highlight some of those other benefits to other wildlife groups. But first, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Xerces Society, we are sort of the Audubon Society of insects. We are perhaps the oldest wildlife conservation organization in the United States that most people are not so familiar with. We are an organization, a nonprofit organization that takes our name from this animal, the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly. This was the first butterfly to go extinct in the United States due to human-influenced habitat loss. It was actually a casualty of the Second World War when the last of its habitat was paved over to build a naval base for the war effort in the San Francisco area. The Xerces Society began originally as a butterfly conservation organization, and over time we've expanded our focus to work on things like freshwater mussels and rare tiger beetles and pollinators such as native bees. We work on a vast diversity of invertebrate wildlife groups. And if you consider the fact that the majority of all described living organisms on Earth are invertebrate animals, then I think you understand the relevance of our work and what our mission is all about. So within the Xerces Society, we've got a couple of core program areas. We have an endangered species program. We have an aquatic conservation program. We have a program working on pesticide policy issues. And then we have our pollinator conservation program, which is maybe increasingly more accurately described or defined as an agricultural biodiversity program. And this is the program that I co-direct, and I'll talk a little bit specifically here about that program. So the Xerces Pollinator Conservation Team has staff biologists located in California, Oregon, Texas, Minnesota, Nebraska, New Jersey, and North Carolina. We're a growing team, and we're adding staff pretty regularly across the country at this point in time. Many of those staff people are in joint partner biologist roles with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, and that team really encompasses an amazing professional background, people with backgrounds in farming and restoration of natural habitats, backgrounds in research entomology, beekeeping, and my own background is in crop consulting and native seed production. And a lot of those skills are relevant to the work that we do here at the Xerces Society today. The Xerces Society's Pollinator Conservation Program also is engaged in extensive education and outreach on pollinator conservation, again, focused primarily on farmers and farm agencies, but we also do outreach to gardeners and naturalists and other conservation organizations. And we routinely reach thousands, if not tens of thousands of people a year through events like this, as well as in-person workshops and field days and web content and publications and so on. We really are increasingly a international organization working in all 50 states and then working increasingly in places like Europe and Latin America and Asia. I won't say much about our pesticide risk reduction training other than to note that pesticides are a factor in pollinator declines, and they have the use of pesticides has a direct impact on pollinator conservation efforts. And so for folks who are interested in that, and I won't again talk specifically about pesticide risk reduction or pesticide risk mitigation today, but I will highlight some of our resources later on in the presentation for those of you who are interested in factoring that into conservation plans. And then the Xerces Society ourselves support and engage in direct habitat restoration for pollinators. And since 2008, we've supported the restoration of around 200,000 acres of wildflower-rich habitat for pollinators across the United States. All right, so to dive right in here, let's talk about why we should restore habitat for monarchs and other pollinators. And I'm sure that everybody tuning into the webinar today has a general understanding of sort of the population trends with monarch butterflies. And according to the best available science, we think that the picture is not very bright right now. We think that over the past 20 years or so, we have seen perhaps a 90% population decline in monarchs. And of course, there is both a eastern population of monarchs and a western population, the western population being the one that overwinters in California along the coast. And we've seen significant declines in both of these populations. And there are a number of factors in play, and I'll touch on a few of those factors. But it's worth noting that, in talking to some of my colleagues here at Xerces, in talking to other monarch conservation professionals, it's been interesting to hear this feedback from them that, in looking at the population decline of monarchs, one of the other species that that decline model resembles is that of the passenger pigeon, which is really sort of an alarming angle to this story of monarch declines. So some of the factors driving monarch declines include things like, the loss of overwintering habitat in places like Mexico or along the California coast. It likely includes the impact of insecticides and herbicides and the loss of milkweed as a result of herbicide use in different agricultural systems. But I want to draw your attention to these other significant trends in pollinator that impact pollinators across the United States. And one of these significant trends has just been the overall loss of permanent perennial grassland and prairie in the United States, especially in sort of the Midwest and upper Midwest, where we have historically had large areas of conservation easement land on private farms. And with the increasing value of commodity crops like corn and soybeans, there has been this real incentivization of the farming community to convert more of that long-term conservation land back into productive cropland. And of course, that's alarming from a monarch conservation standpoint. But these changes in land use, these changes in sort of the ubiquity of insecticides in the landscape are having effects beyond just monarchs. So I want to make this point that monarch declines are really only part of the story. And we are seeing similar, in some cases, perhaps significantly more alarming declines in some of our other pollinators. And this is particularly true among our native bumblebees. And we've got some great folks here at the Xerces Society who are working to better understand the conservation status of these other pollinators. And there's been some really interesting work here done around bumblebees and these findings that perhaps 1 in 3 or 30% of North America's bumblebee species are potentially at risk of decline, if not risk of extinction. And looking at your screen here, for example, you can see in the upper right-hand corner Franklin's bumblebee. This is a bumblebee that was native to the West Coast, to California and Oregon. And this is a species that we think may be extinct today. And we have these other species of bumblebees that are increasingly imperiled as well. So habitat restoration doesn't just support monarchs, but it supports these other pollinators as well. And of course, beyond bumblebees, we're seeing declines in our managed honeybees, and in the past half century or so, we've seen about a 50% decline in the number of managed honeybees in this country. In that same time frame, we've seen a doubling of cropland that requires bee pollination. So we have these two opposing trends that should cause all of us some concern about the sustainability of our agriculture and the sustainability of ecosystem services like pollination. There are many factors in play that are impacting honeybee declines. In all likelihood, habitat loss is playing a role. The introduction of diseases and parasites like the varroa mite here you can see on the back of this honeybee are also factors in honeybee declines. But I want to make the point that beyond monarchs, pollinators in general are something that we should all be thinking about today. So what can we do? I'm asked regularly here in my work, what is the single most important thing that anybody can do to protect monarchs or to protect bumblebees or to conserve pollinators as a whole? And I really want to make the point that habitat is the key ingredient. In the case of monarchs specifically, habitat provides nectar to sustain breeding and migration. Habitat provides milkweed host plants for the monarchs to lay eggs on. Habitat can and should provide refuge from pesticides. It should provide sort of a safe zone for pollinator numbers to increase and to spread across the landscape and to mitigate the impacts of areas where pesticides may be used intensively. And habitat actually has some real-world economic benefits. If we look, again, beyond monarchs and look at pollinators in general and the role of habitat, we can see, for example, that we've got research coming out of Michigan State University showing that wildflower field borders planted near blueberry farms results in direct yield increases to those adjacent crops. In some cases, the wild bees that are sustained by these wildflower-rich field borders can contribute hundreds of pounds of additional fruit through increased pollination to those farms, resulting in hundreds of dollars of additional crop value per acre on an annual basis. Habitat, again, supports honeybees, and we see that research demonstrating honeybee access to more diverse pollen and nectar sources results in a greater immune response on the part of honeybees. So it makes them more resistant to things like diseases if they have all of the micronutrients that a large, diverse array of different wildflower pollens and nectars can provide them. We see that habitat can enhance pest control in farms and gardens. And research demonstrates that if more than 20% of a farm is in diverse habitat, that measurable levels of pest control by beneficial insects like syrphid flies can be observed throughout crop fields. And the Xerces Society is just wrapping up some wonderful work in California with partners at UC Berkeley that actually tested this. We for example, took stink bug egg masses. Stink bugs are a significant agricultural pest of some crops in California. We took the egg masses of these stink bugs and we put them on basically index cards and pinned these index cards at different distances out in the middle of a crop field. And then we looked at the adjacent habitat surrounding those crop fields. And we saw that the crop fields that were surrounded by native, drought-resistant, flowering California trees and shrubs, that where that native plant field border was present, we could go out 100 or 200 meters into the middle of the crop field and see more of those stink bug eggs attacked by beneficial insects than we saw on farms that did not have native plant habitat surrounding them. So habitat actually enhances pest control. And conversely, the research also bears out that habitat does not generally support pests. So pests of agricultural crops generally don't thrive in things like native plant hedgerows or wildflower field borders. And this was part of our UC Berkeley Xerces study. We actually saw that native plant habitat surrounding cropland actually supported fewer pests like aphids or cucumber beetles or flea beetles than highly disturbed weedy habitat surrounding those same fields. So habitat is really the key ingredient. And from here, I'm gonna move into sort of the nuts and bolts of how you approach habitat restoration as a process and those step-by-step fundamentals. But I do want to pause here and just check in with Wendy. And Wendy, do we have one or two key questions that we want to pause for at this point, or should we keep going?
I'm going to let you keep going at this point. We've had a few questions come in, but a lot of people want to get into the nuts and bolts of habitat restoration. So I'm going to let you keep going.
All right, sounds good. So let's dig in here to the habitat restoration process. And there are different approaches to restoring native plant habitat for monarchs or for other wildlife. What I'm going to give you here is sort of the Xerces Society's approach, this 5-step or 5-phase process to habitat restoration, which includes site selection and evaluation, planning and design, site preparation, plant establishment, and the long-term management of those restored areas. And I will drill down into each of these phases here in a little bit more detail. So let's look at phase 1, site selection and evaluation. This is the part of the restoration process where you're really identifying your project goals, you're delineating the size of the restoration area, and as part of that, what we typically do is we use tools like soil maps to understand what types of native plants that particular site is going to be most hospitable for. We will sometimes conduct more of a formal habitat assessment process or habitat assessment survey, and I'll direct you to the Xerces Habitat Assessment Guide here at the end of our presentation. But we also want to understand what was the site's historic condition. So it's important to ask, for example, are we trying to create a wildflower meadow on a soil type or in a biome that normally would be a hardwood forest or a conifer forest? And that's not to say we can't do it, but that necessitates sort of a different thinking process and it may be a different site preparation process and a different set of expectations. And really what we're primarily trying to do in most cases is identify sort of the historic baseline condition of the site and to replicate that. So was it formerly tallgrass prairie? Was it formerly a native California grassland? What can we do to restore that heritage to the site? We also are interested in things like whether or not there's herbicide use on the site that may have some residual activity. So things like treslin may inhibit seed germination, and we want to know about things like that. We want to know how weedy the site is so that we have a sense of how much dormant weed seed we're going to be fighting against in a particular restoration site. And of course, we want to evaluate the surrounding land use as well, and recognize, for example, that habitat adjacent to cropland might be prone to pesticide drift, and we need to think about that and maybe scale back expectations or work with the farm to reduce pesticide use on at least the most immediately adjacent part of the crop system. But we need to factor in all of these different site-specific and adjacent land use factors in designing a good restoration project. So this moves us into phase 2, the planning and design phase. And in this phase, it's really important that you first begin with a realistic timeline. So if you're looking at a site that may have been neglected for years and years and years and may be dominated by invasive, non-native vegetation, you have to move into that process recognizing that it may take you longer than it would to convert a relatively clean site, a site that has not been dominated by invasive weeds, for example. And it's important as part of that timeline planning process to factor in when you should be doing things like seeding or adding transplants so that you're planting at the correct time of the year for seeds to germinate and establish, or for transplants to be able to establish themselves without going through prolonged periods of hot, dry weather, etc. Now, we use, at the Xerces Society, a number of tools to help with this planning process. We use, for example, aerial photos of farms, software as basic as kind of Google Earth can help you look at a site overhead and begin to delineate the project boundaries. For slightly more sophisticated tools, we can use the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Services online soil survey to look at aerial photos and to overlay soil maps with those project sites. We look at our own plant guides and the plant guides of other conservation organizations and agencies to help inform plant selection so that we can identify which species are locally adapted. We want to, of course, make sure that the species that we want to plant and establish on that site are actually commercially available. So we spend a lot of time looking at native seed company catalogs and inventory databases. We begin sort of in the second phase to start to formulate seed mixes, and we do this using the Xerces seed mix calculator, which you can download. I've got the link here on the screen for those of you who are interested in that. But this is a simple Excel spreadsheet that we can enter different wildflower or native grass species into. We can enter the price of those species. We can decide how much of the plant community on a percentage basis we want to be milkweed, for example, versus a grass like little blue stem. And we can make these calculations, and the seed mix calculator will automatically total up the amount of seed we need to buy for the project area, and it will help us estimate the cost of that as well. Moving into phase 3, so after the initial site selection and evaluation and then the planning and design process, the most important part of native plant restoration is really site preparation. And I know that there's a lot of opinions in the world among restoration ecologists about sort of the correct process for restoring native plant communities. But this is one area where I think there's really broad consensus that site preparation is the single most important step. And this is the phase where you really get what you pay for in terms of both financial investments as well as investments of time and labor. And consistently, I think we see that weed eradication specifically within the site preparation phase is really, really important and probably the most critical factor for success. So on really, really weedy sites, we will sometimes invest more than a year to remove not just the existing vegetation, but to try to deplete the dormant weed seed bank. Now, many people in the restoration ecology world are highly, highly dependent upon herbicides for weed abatement and to remove existing competing vegetation. And that can certainly work. There are other approaches to weed abatement and preparing an area for replanting in native vegetation. One that we really like is solarization, which is the use of high tunnel, UV stabilized. High tunnel is a type of greenhouse. So it's basically UV stabilized greenhouse plastic that we put on the ground and bury the edges and allow the sunlight throughout the summer months to heat the soil underneath, killing both the existing vegetation and killing the dormant weed seed, and in all likelihood killing some of the soil microbial community that is associated with the root systems of non-native vegetation. This is a process that has, for us, been more successful than the use of herbicides, and it's something that we are continuing to do more of on a larger and larger scale, and we've had success with this both in warm climates like California, but also in more northern latitudes and in cooler climates as well. Solarization does, of course, depend upon plastic. Plastic is something that we don't want to see end up in landfills. And our philosophy has been to look for durable plastic that we can reuse. And in the case of some farms, we'll just lift it up from one site and move it over and put it down on a new area, and in sort of a patchwork way begin to solarize larger and larger areas and restore larger and larger areas over an extended period to natural habitat for pollinators. So solarization has been really effective for us because it does specifically help kill the dormant weed seed in the ground and create a much less competitive environment for native plants to become established in. Conversely, if you are using herbicides, the standard advice, and I would tend to agree with this, the standard advice is to not cultivate the soil after spraying it with herbicide, simply because that can bring up buried dormant weed seed closer to the soil surface where it can germinate, and it can present a competitive disadvantage for anything that you plant in that area. So we don't typically recommend tillage of any kind as a site preparation process. We do recommend some basic seed bed preparation, basically just lightly smoothing the surface, and on small sites that might just consist of raking. On larger sites it might consist of rolling the area with something like an agricultural cultipacker or a water-filled turf grass roller that you might see used on like golf courses or on people's lawns to smooth out clods in the soil. But basically we recommend folks not cultivate the soil, do what they can to deplete the dormant weed seed, and to try to create a fairly smooth, open seed bed for planting into. And we've got more details about this process in publications like Establishing Pollinator Meadows from Seed, You can see the download address there on your screen, and I will direct you to those resources here again later on in the presentation as well. So phase 4, after you do the site preparation, you're in the planting phase. And depending on how you do the site preparation, it may take you a year, it may take you several years if you're using tools like herbicides. If you're using solarization, we can typically do that site preparation process in just a few months over the summer. The planting process itself is the direct follow-on and is a fairly quick process, although it's the process that we all sort of look forward to when we are immersed in a habitat restoration effort. There are multiple ways you can establish wildflower seed, and I'll talk about transplants here in a moment. But if you are creating or recreating an area using wildflower and native grass seed, you can, on small sites, simply hand scatter that like you would be just like feeding chickens out of a bucket. We do this routinely on sites that are under 1 acre in size. I think some of the basic things we do to ensure success are, first, we will mix the seed in a bucket with at least equal amounts of a inert carrier like sand or peat moss or rice hulls, something simply to add extra volume to that seed mix. That helps keep the different sizes and shapes of seed held in more of an equal suspension. It also helps you see where you are throwing or broadcasting that seed on the planting area, because many wildflower seeds are very, very small. They're difficult to see once they're on the soil, but if you add something like sand or rice hulls to that seed mix, you can begin to immediately see where it's falling on the ground and to understand if you're evenly distributing it across the planting area. When we're hand scattering, we'll usually divide that seed mix into 2 different quantities, and we'll usually seed the area walking in 2 different perpendicular directions, just to ensure that we're covering the entire area as evenly as possible. Now, there are many ways to seed areas using much larger equipment. You can see here in the lower right-hand photo my colleague Jessa Cruz in California driving this specialized native seed drill on this larger planting site. There are these tools out there, and there are tools that are sort of in between in size from, hand broadcasting with a bucket. You can in the sort of middle of these different extremes, you can find tools like belly grinder seeders. You can find ATV mounted broadcast seeders. I think if you are using any type of equipment, it's important to have some training on that equipment and to know how to calibrate that equipment so that you're broadcasting the seed equally over the entire planting area. And finally, just a few thoughts here on sort of seeding rates and timing. So for seeding rates, we're usually seeding sites at a rate of 40 to 60 seeds per square foot. That Xerces seed mix calculator, which I mentioned earlier and I'll direct you to later, can help you figure out exactly how much seed you need based upon your planting area to meet that sort of seeding rate target. And then finally, we recommend dormant seedings wherever possible. So seeding during the dormant season, if you're in a cold climate, that may be late fall or early winter. In California, for example, we're oftentimes seeding in very late in the year, around November or December, to take advantage of winter rain. If you're working with transplants, and transplants are a great way to restore habitat, you get a much faster start to the growth of your plants. You can oftentimes have flowering plants in the ground the first year of the planting phase of your project. Transplants are perfectly appropriate for that. The downsides of transplants are that they are expensive and it's hard to cover really, really large areas, like multiple acres of habitat with transplants alone. But if you are using transplants, some simple things to think about include whether the decision on whether or not you want to use weed barriers, whether or not you want to use animal guards to protect from gophers or deer or rabbits from eating your newly planted transplants. It's important to mulch your new transplants and to irrigate them immediately at planting. Usually in terms of longer range management, we cut off all of the irrigation to the transplants we use after about 2 years of planting. And that includes even those plantings in dry climates like really arid parts of California. Drip irrigation systems and other sort of precision irrigation technology is really, really valuable for conserving water and for keeping these newly transplanted native trees and shrubs and forests alive. So finally here, phase 5 is the long-term habitat management phase. And we could spend perhaps a week of webinars on long-term habitat management and still perhaps only scratch the surface. But a few things to think about are these ideas of weed management in your restored areas and the need to maintain plant diversity in especially meadows or prairie type plantings. In terms of weed management, one of the simple strategies that we use and most prairie restorationists use is to mow perennial meadows very often in the first 2 years after planting. So typically if you're planting, say, a prairie in Iowa or Minnesota, it's not uncommon to see your non-native annual weeds grow really, really aggressively in the first year after planting. We will go in and typically mow those sites multiple times during the first 2 years to prevent those annual weeds from producing seed. The lower growing, slower growing perennials can tolerate that mowing those first few years, and they actually benefit from having more access to sunlight and less competition for resources. So they can tolerate a little bit of mowing, and that mowing helps them begin to slowly grow and overtake the annuals, which will eventually disappear from the planting site. You can also manage weeds, of course, with hand weeding on small sites. Some people use spot spraying to control weeds. There's lots of different ways to go about it, but it is important as part of your initial planning phase to think about this weed management issue and to be realistic about what you can do and how you're going to do it. And then, of course, you want to maintain plant diversity in your meadows over time or in your prairie plantings over time. One of the ways to do that is to introduce intermittent disturbance to the site, such as going in and lightly raking meadows or prairie plantings, or to lightly disc them every few years, and then to overseed them with additional wildflower seed to re-stimulate some additional plant growth and some additional diversity in that site. So I'm going to wrap up this part of the presentation with just some examples, some real-world examples of this type of restoration work. So here's an example of a wildflower field border on a farm here in Oregon, Headwaters Farm out near Troutdale, Oregon. This is a farm, this is an organic farm, so we wanted to create a wildflower strip for them using fully organic methods. We first went through and cultivated this seed bed, and again, cultivation is something that will bring up dormant weed seed and potentially stimulate new weed growth. But in this case, after cultivating that seed bed and smoothing it out, we laid down this solarization plastic over the top. We did this in June. We left it on for June, July, and August. In the lower left-hand corner, you can see us removing that plastic in the fall. And again, we roll that plastic up and we reuse it, and we reuse it for years and years and years. So it's, I guess it is sort of a renewable tool in our arsenal for creating habitat. So immediately after removing that plastic, we went back in, we seeded the area, we hung a sign in the area, and I'll walk you through each of these steps. So here we are, May of 2013, with our newly cultivated strip. June of 2013, we installed this solarization plastic. And again, we left this on for June, July, and August. September or October, this came off. We immediately went in and overseeded this area after the plastic was removed. And here we are 1 year later, May 2014, with the initial wildflower germination already taking place. And this site, because of that solarization, is almost completely weed-free during this initial planting phase. There's almost no dormant weed seed in this strip for these wildflowers to compete with. So here we are, May 2014. Here we are, July 2014, with this field of Clarkia now in full bloom at the peak of summer. So this is a very short timeline that solarization allows us to create habitat like this with. We've removed that plastic and we have it now on a different area of the farm. We are creating this whole patchwork system of wildflower strips on this farm that include more than a dozen species of Oregon natives, including showy milkweed. Here's another example of a different example and another example of a habitat restoration process. This one's in California. This is a roadside that we wanted to restore for bumblebees and monarch butterflies and hummingbirds. Here you can see what the roadside initially looked like, a highly disturbed agricultural roadside. The landowners used herbicide and cultivation to keep the weeds down. It was dusty. It was not very pleasant to look at. So we went through, we added irrigation, an irrigation line to this mile-long roadside. We dug holes. We planted native shrubs into these holes, and this is what it looked like a year later. In June of 2013, you can see there are already flowers blooming in this hedgerow. Incredible species in this hedgerow, things like California fuchsia, various lupins, salvias, elderberries, milkweed, etc. Here we are, summer of last year. Look at the size of that milkweed. Extremely rapid growth, just following these basic principles of good planning, site preparation, irrigating your transplants, and controlling weeds with hand weeding and mulching around the plant. So very functional, very attractive roadside feature on a fairly short timeline. And I should mention that California is in the midst of this epic drought right now, and these plants are all coming off irrigation. The irrigation is being removed, and these are drought-resistant, native, adapted plants that are continuing to thrive on that site. I'm going to go through a few more examples here, and then we'll break for some questions. But here's an example of a similar site, a dairy farm in Wisconsin, a non-native cool season pasture restored to native habitat for the endangered Karner blue butterfly. There's an example of one of our pollinator meadows that we've developed in California. An example of an urban meadow here in Portland, Oregon. The replacement of a lawn, a lawn that requires regular irrigation throughout the summer, a lawn that requires regular mowing with a mix of wildflowers that require very little annual maintenance. An example of a field border in Massachusetts on a cranberry farm. This was a weedy field border that we removed the existing vegetation from. We hydro-seeded in this case, and you can see the green hydro-seeding mulch on the inset photo. So we hydro-seeded the site because it was on a slope, and we didn't want the seed to wash away, and this is the result afterwards. Here's an example of a rangeland planting that we developed in California, so we can integrate wildflowers even into agricultural lands that are used for grazing or used for livestock. An example of a native prairie front yard in Wisconsin. Again, replacing irrigation-dependent turf grass and turf grass that requires mowing with native species. There's an example of a bioswale here in Oregon. These are parking strip plantings that absorb surface runoff from the streets and filter that surface runoff before it makes its way into the storm sewer. So it's the root systems and stems of native plants. In this case, showy milkweed and sedges and other plants that are filtering that runoff water. I'm going to wrap up here with a few thoughts on Project Milkweed and just direct you to some additional resources. And I don't have very many slides here. These are slides that we can get through in about 5 minutes or so. But we are at about 5 minutes to the hour here, and I thought, Wendy, we should maybe break here. And are there 1 or 2 questions that we should take right now, and then we can take more questions after I get through the remainder of the slides here?
Yeah, I've been highlighting quite a few questions here. There was a lot of interest in solarization and expanding more on that. For example, how large of an area can you prepare using this method, and how long does it take? Which season is best to begin? Questions like that. So could you expand a little more on solarization techniques?
Sure. So the solarization, again, we use greenhouse, UV stabilized greenhouse plastic, and it comes in standard widths. And I think the upper limit of those widths is usually around 36 or 48 feet wide. And you can have these custom cut to various lengths. So you can easily buy, a length of this plastic that may be 200 feet, 200 feet long by 36 feet wide. So you're constrained a little bit by the standard commercial sizes of these different sheets of plastic, but you can place these next to each other to solarize larger and larger areas. I'll direct you to a guide to the solarization process here coming up in a couple of moments that can give you some more specific details. But in terms of timing and timeline, again, this is usually done in the summer months. We usually lay the plastic in June and then remove it in September or early October, depending on where you are. So it's a very short process. Do we have another question?
Sure. There was a little bit of interest in planting pollinator plants along roadsides. What's your take on insects killed by vehicles or road salt even?
Yeah, the road salt one is not something that I know very much about, and I know that there is a little bit of research out there on the impacts of salts, at least on native plants, if not on the insects themselves. I don't think I can speak to that. But I can speak to the issue of car collisions, and the little bit that I know, and I should mention that my colleague Jennifer Hopwood here at the Xerces Society has a wonderful fact sheet on our website about roadsides and pollinators. Her review of the research seemed to indicate that planting native vegetation, wildflower-rich vegetation along roadsides actually reduced butterfly collisions with cars because the added richness of that habitat adjacent to roadsides actually kept the butterflies in those areas foraging and collecting nectar rather than having them move across the roadside as frequently in search of other flowers. So I think that's sort of the state of the research, that roadside plantings actually reduce butterfly mortality. And if we could, why don't I just wrap up here with kind of the remainder of our slides and some additional resources. We are at the top of the hour here, and I realize we got a little bit of a slow start here, and Wendy and I are committed to staying on here until half past the hour just to take additional questions for folks who can stay with us. But I will wrap up here quickly, and I just want to highlight finally here this project that we've been incubating at the Xerces Society for a number of years called Project Milkweed, that has worked with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service and the private seed industry to try to bring additional sources of milkweed seed to market in parts of the country where it's not widely available. So places like Texas, California, Florida, the Great Basin. These are regions where historically it's been really challenging to find widely available commercial sources of milkweed seed. So we've been working with seed growers in these respective regions to go out and wild collect foundation seed and then to amplify that seed in a nursery or farm setting and then to make that seed available to the public. This has been really successful for us. We have produced jointly with these partners over 35 million seeds, and I think that number is vastly out of date at this point. But we've really, through this project, made 10 previously unavailable species of milkweed now available in the nursery trade in at least 10 states. And I'll show you where you can access some of that seed now. And as part of this process, we've developed this comprehensive guide to milkweed conservation. This is, I have a copy of it here in front of me, so I'm going to do a quick page count. This is basically a 150-page guide on the ecology and conservation and propagation of milkweeds for those of you who are interested. This is available as a free download on our website, has extensive sections on the relationships of milkweeds with specialist insects that feed upon milkweeds. It's got information on planting techniques that maximize your chances of success with milkweed. It has case studies of milkweeds used in roadside habitat projects, etc. So I would encourage you to check that out. And if you're interested in the milkweed seed itself, whether it's the seed that we've helped bring to market through Project Milkweed, or whether it's seed that may already have been available through native seed companies in your region, I would encourage you to check out the Milkweed Seed Finder on our website. This is an online database of all of the commercially available milkweed seed sources that we know of. You can go on this website, you can select your state, you can also select different species of milkweed that you might be looking for or interested in. And it's a tool coming out of this Project Milkweed process to help link you to the raw materials to do the conservation work. Also on our website, we have, again, these seed mix calculators to help you formulate seed mixes for your specific projects. We have different installation guides for habitat types in different parts of the country, whether it's meadow or prairie habitat in the upper Midwest or hedgerows in California. You can download region-specific habitat installation guides on our website. Most of these resources can be found within the Pollinator Conservation Resource Center, which is simply at xerces.org/pollinator-resource-center. You can find directories of native plant nurseries in your region. You can find information on pesticide risk reduction guidelines. You can find information about other pollinators, such as native bees, on this site as well. You can also find more information through our book, Attracting Native Pollinators. And if you are interested in this concept that I talked about earlier of using good bugs to prey upon bad bugs as an alternative to pesticides, I would encourage you to check out our new book, Farming with Native Beneficial Insects. This is available from any major book dealer, and it includes more of the research findings from this joint Xerces-UC Berkeley project. And it includes some amazing case studies from all across the United States. And then finally here, in terms of additional resources, if you are interested in direct habitat restoration support yourself, whether it is simply project planning or an actual turnkey sort of support system to help you plant wildflowers and pick wildflowers and remove the initial invasive plant community and replace it with something that looks more like this, I would encourage you to reach out to us. If you are a farmer and you're eligible for USDA programs, we can sometimes provide that support at low cost or in some cases no cost through leveraging programs from the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. But we work with a lot of different agencies and organizations, so I would encourage you to reach out if you are looking for support in making your landscape look like this one on the screen. So finally here, my final thoughts are probably best summarized by Dr. Edith Patch, who was the first female president of the Entomological Society of America, who way back in 1938 made this really amazing prediction that by the year 2000, the President of the United States would issue a proclamation claiming that land areas at regular intervals throughout the U.S. would be maintained as insect gardens under the direction of government entomologists. These would be planted with milkweed, hawthorn, and other plants that could sustain populations of bees and butterflies, and she predicted that at some point in the future, entomologists will be as much or more concerned with the conservation and preservation of beneficial insect life as they are now with the destruction of injurious insects. And we're a little bit past the year 2000, but I think this is coming true, and I think it's coming true through the efforts of all of the great agency folks who tuned in today to learn more about this and who are taking these concepts back to their work and implementing them on the ground. And I think this is coming true through the efforts of every one of you, whether you are a gardener or a roadside manager, all of you who are interested in this, excited about this, and who are working to create monarch and pollinator habitat in your own communities are really bringing this vision to life. So thank you guys for your efforts. I am going to stick around here and take any questions that folks might have.
Sorry for the lag. I'm going to jump in and just, for those of you still on the line that need to go, thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Eric and the Xerces Society for providing this wonderful resource. Thanks to the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Conservation Training Center, and the Monarch Joint Venture for making this webinar series possible. I hope that you'll all join us for the next webinar in the series. I don't have a date set for the next webinar, but we're making plans to hopefully have a webinar in March. Keep an eye out on our website, monarchjointventure.org, for updated information, and we'll also distribute an email. We're interested in hearing your thoughts following up on the webinar and any ideas that you have about monarch-related topics. So we're going to distribute a short survey by email after the webinar to allow you to share your thoughts with us. So with that, we have quite a few more questions coming in, so Eric and I are going to stay on and try to answer as many as possible. Within a few weeks, we'll try to gathered together some informational resources and answers to your questions that we'll distribute by email or through our website. So thank you all again for participating in the Monarch Conservation webinar series, and we'll move to some questions. And I have to answer the question, ask the question. So, yeah. I'm going to scroll back to the top of my multiple pages of questions here. There were some questions about mowing. So how, do you have recommendations for the heights that you should mow at? How often should you mow everything? Is that different between site installation and site management, things like that?
Yeah, so mowing is a tool that we typically use after establishing a new prairie or a new perennial meadow, a meadow consisting of primarily perennial plants, perennial forbs or perennial wildflowers, and native perennial grasses. It's a tool that we usually only use routinely for the first couple of years after planting. So if we were to seed a new prairie area in the fall, then usually the following spring we would come back and we would mow it as soon as there were any annual weeds that were beginning to produce flowers, and so we would mow them to prevent those flowers from maturing and producing seed. And then we would go back, perhaps 4 weeks later, perhaps 6 weeks later, and we would do that throughout the growing season again, mowing just enough to prevent most of those annual weeds from producing seed. And we might do that throughout that entire year after seeding an area the previous fall, and then we may go back even the second year and do it again if there's still a lot of annual or if there are some biennial weeds that are showing up in that planting site. And then usually in sort of the third year, we will cease that entirely and let that prairie or that meadow begin to completely take off and let those wildflowers grow to their full potential and begin flowering. There is this rhyme or this idiom that's sometimes used in prairie restoration that kind of refers to this process, and it goes something like, in the first year after planting, the prairie sleeps, the second year it creeps, and the third year it leaps. And it's pretty typical. So usually, we don't expect to see a lot of wildflowers the first year or second year anyway. So that mowing phase is a short part of the process, and after that, it may be something that we only do once or, once a year, once every other year, simply to remove some of the tall, dead vegetation and create more light for the plants that are now established to take off.
All right. Does solarization kill soil microbes and beneficial invertebrates?
Very likely, yes. Yeah, and this is something that we were really concerned about initially. I was really concerned about it, and I come from a background in horticulture and have spent a lot of my career thinking about soils and soil health, and it was really concerning to me initially when we started doing it. Thinking about exactly that we may be killing off beneficials and maybe killing off beneficial microbial communities. But especially having worked now more in the West and having, I think, greater exposure to the scientists who think that soil microbial communities have a role in facilitating non-native plants and plant invasions, I think that those potential risks are outweighed by the possibility that solarization is killing off soil microbes, soil fungi, soil bacteria that may have symbiotic relationships with the dominant non-native vegetation. And so by solarizing it and removing that soil microbial community, we create more of a clean slate for the establishment of our more desirable native plants. for pollinator habitat project. There's some speculation that it may even be worth inoculating these restored areas, the soils in these restored areas, with soil from remnant high-quality plant communities. And I have not tested this. I've not seen a lot of science around this, but I think it's an interesting idea and worthy of additional research and exploration.
Great. Could you tell us a little bit more about if and what your thoughts are on the role of forests as monarch habitat?
Yeah, the role of forests, I think, is variable, as our forests are variable. And it's, a Doug fir forest in the Pacific Northwest is a very different sort of ecosystem and very different community of plants and animals than, say, a longleaf pine forest in the southeast. So it's hard for me to, I think, provide a kind of overarching statement to the value of forests. Forests have value in their own right and in their own way. Monarchs, like most butterflies, tend to be more common in open, sunny habitats like prairies and meadows and grasslands. And I think the value of forests to them is probably most apparent at their overwintering sites. And within the continental U.S., I think the other value of them is simply in those forests that can provide some understory plants, whether they're milkweeds or whether they're nectar plants that monarchs really depend upon.
Great. We've had quite a few questions on prescribed fire or burning. Do you have thoughts on this as a management practice to establish or maintain habitat for monarchs? Is it harmful to pollinators? What are the advantages?
Yeah, so fire, there are some very strong opinions out there about the value of fire for prairie or grassland restoration. And I think that the growing consensus is that it really requires sort of site-specific consideration and species-specific consideration. So we know some prairie communities and some butterfly specialists of those prairie communities that really seem to suffer from the effects of fire. Monarchs are probably not one of those species. Monarchs are typically not in those systems at the time of the year when most prescribed burning takes place, and may benefit overall from the use of fire as a maintenance tool or management tool for prairies and grasslands. But it's important that we look at the other insects in those landscapes as well and make sure that we're not recommending fire where there may be sensitive species or site specialists that could be harmed by fire.
Okay, coming back to the mowing question, someone pointed out that we didn't establish, is there a recommended height for mowing for pollinators to reduce impact on pollinators?
The mowing height there are no firm guidelines for it. You really want to mow as high as you can mow with the expectation that you want to cut off the flowers of any annual or biennial weeds, but you don't want to mow so low to the ground that you're basically scalping the crowns of the more desirable vegetation that may just be getting established. So generally as high as your mower can safely operate and still effectively cut off most of the flowers of your weeds. And as a sort of a side example of this, when I lived in Wisconsin and noticed a committed group of people around the Madison area who were really interested in managing native prairies in their yards and in their home landscapes. It was not uncommon to see folks who had just a regular yard, residential yard push mower, and they would take the wheels off it and replace them with taller wheels to be able to mow their prairie occasionally. So there are these sort of creative ways of getting your mower to that optimal height.
Okay. We've still got quite a few people on the line, so I'll come at you with a few more questions here.
Sure.
Does the seed calculator allow for variances depending on site condition? For example, starting from a bare field versus a field with 70% covered soil?
It does not. Really, what you would do is you would decide going into it whether or not you want to seed the area really, really heavily at a rate of, say, 60 or 70 seeds per square foot, which you may feel like you need to do if you've got not very good conditions for seed establishment or sort of questionable site preparation. You may want to enter that as your initial value. If you feel like your site condition is very good, if you feel like your planting technology is very good, you may want to dial that back and set your initial seeding rate target at about 40 seeds per square foot. So you can control that based upon your own assessment of your site conditions and your planting process.
Do you have that conversion, do you have it converted to pounds per acre? You recommended 40 seeds per square foot. Do you have that conversion by chance?
Yeah, I don't, but the calculator does that. And there is
Okay.
no standard conversion. It's based upon the species that you add to the calculator. So different plant species have different numbers of seed by weight, and consequently the overall pounds per acre changes depending upon the species and depending upon the seeding rate. The calculator does that for you.
Okay, and I apologize if you've covered this already, but do you have, does Xerces use do you have a preferred ratio of grasses to forbs for the seed mix when you're looking to install pollinator habitat?
Yeah, that ratio changes a little bit depending upon the region of the country. Generally, we do at least 25% grasses to our seed mixes, and usually less than 50. So somewhere in that 25 to 50% range seems to be kind of a sweet spot for us.
Okay. For a site that is in sod, what site prep would you recommend? They're in Vermont and do not anticipate heavy weed pressure. Would tilling and seeding be appropriate?
I think with sod, the weed pressure could still be really, really significant. And the sod itself, having a rhizomatous grass, simply cultivating that is probably not going to kill the grass entirely. You could do really, really deep moldboard plowing and actually invert the upper soil profile and bury that sod grass. So a moldboard plow would sort of pick it up and flip it over and bury it, and you could plant on that and have relatively weed-free conditions. You could rent a sod cutter from a local hardware store and use that to physically remove the sod and then plant over the soil and probably have pretty good success. And then solarization, again, is something that we've had really good success with even at northern climates and in cold climates like New England.
Okay. I think this one might be a good opportunity to wrap things up. There's still quite a few questions that I know we didn't get to, but we're going to try to pull together some resources and follow up by email. And Eric, I will rely on you to help me with that if you're up for it. But thank you to the 329 viewers that are still with us. But we are going to wrap things up.